officially episode 2 of Super Bulky. The Linen Appreciation Month is over. Those are little special episodes in between. So in our Super Bulky numbering system, we're on episode 2. And what do we have this month?
We've got our sample swatches from the shop.
It's true. So we've shown off a lot of these last month. We certainly show off a lot of them in the shop. We try and have one for basically every yarn that we carry. And they're all identical. So we make up these little swatches. They're samplers that have different stitch patterns in each one. And every swatch is identical so that we can show off how the yarns will look knitted up and get a little bit of experience knitting with all of them, which is, important if you're trying to sell a product and educate your customers and tell them why they would want to use yarn X for this project instead of yarn Y, or why they should really consider yarn Z, even though it doesn't look so enticing this way, but when you try it this way. And these swatches help us do all that. So from a shop owner's perspective, it was important to me when I was looking at things other shops had done, things that yarn customers, things that knitters like to see, that I had something to show that because of course I don't have time to knit a sweater up in every yarn. That would be awful. But I do have the time and the need to experience all the yarns, at least in a little bit of a way. So we split some of that work. So we have some other people around who knit some of the swatches, because I do want the customers to see and feel and get an idea for what the swatches are like. And some of the swatches, it's, I guess you could think it was an amusing waste of time, because just like, what on earth is happening in this yarn? Why would you spend time knitting all of these sections that look just identical? But there is a reason we do that, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But we also wanted to talk about why you might want to knit a similar sample or swatch yourself. There are people in the world, I have heard, who only buy yarn when they know exactly what project they're going to make with it. And they come in with the powder and they look and they find yarn, and they don't buy any more yarn until that yarn's done.
Wow.
Could you imagine? Yeah, I'm not that person. I buy yarn just because it looks cool and I get it, but sometimes it'll just sit there. So the swatches are a good way to get to know a yarn. And in fact, Tim, you got to know knitting in the first place, got exposed to knitting techniques to begin with by getting this as sort of an assignment.
Yeah, I made my first 2 scarves, and then it was okay, here, make this sample swatch. And I was like, oh, it looks scary and complex because it's got these things and it has cables and I've never done that, and it has lace and I've never done that, but we got through it, and now I make half of the ones that we have in the shop. So it's a lot of fun, and it lets you get familiar with the yarn. It lets you know how it's gonna feel when you're working it up. We really should maybe work on getting some crochet swatches too.
Yeah, I've been working on some prototypes. Yeah,
that's definitely a goal,
because I want to have those as well. I tried pawning it off on my sister. Could you design a crochet swatch for? And no, it never happened.
Sometimes you'll get a yarn and you'll think oh, this is going to be really unforgiving and unpleasant, and then you'll be surprised when it works up and it blocks out really nicely, and the stitches that you were worried about being enlarged because you set it down to go help someone come out just fine once you've blocked it. Mm-hmm. And then there are some that come out exactly how you expect.
Right. And I should add,
that one.
Yeah, we also block all the swatches in exactly the same way. They all have the exact same cast on and the exact same bind off. We treat them identically from start to finish, so that really the differences that crop up between swatches are differences in the yarn itself. So if you are not one of those interesting people who buy only the yarn you need when you have a project in mind, and you have mystery wonderful swatches sitting at home, why might you make one of these swatches? Because we're sharing the swatch pattern with you. The link will be down in the description. But what has been your experience of things that you've learned about yarns? You've talked about whether or not it's forgiving. What else do you see?
There are definitely times when a stitch pattern will disappear in the color. There are, you might find that your cables don't come out as raised or puffy as you were hoping,
Right.
or maybe as flat or subdued as you were hoping, maybe,
Right.
if
It
that's
could be
something
either
that
way.
you're wanting. You might find that your lace gets closed up because of like the natural like bloom of the yarn. Like there are a lot of things to keep in mind when you're planning a project, and you don't want to get like the neck part of your sweater done and then get to like the chest that has fancy lace work and find out that the lace
Right.
does not look the way you want it to
All
look.
of the eyelets on the right hand side are winking closed, and all the one on the left hand side are like open and smeared. That'll happen with off balance yarns sometimes. And we've had customers who come in and see the swatches, and they're just like, "Is there a pattern for that?" You're like, why? But we've had people, we've given it to them, and they've just kept repeating it and made it into a scarf. So, play. It's fun. So I'm going to take you into the classroom, and we're going to look individually at many of these skeins and look at the 5 different sections of the Twisted Skein swatch, and we'll see what's going on with it.
Way cool.
So here we are in the Twisted Skein classroom. Welcome. This is where the action happens in terms of our classes, our one-on-one appointments. And you can see my reference library, there's swatches, there's rules, classroom policies. So welcome. And now let's take a close look at some of the swatches that we've been talking about. So the swatch has 5 sections. And in each of the sections, you can really get a feel for the characteristics that a given yarn is going to have, particularly when compared to others. So the first thing is, we mentioned all of the swatches are knit to an identical pattern. That means they always have the same stitch count, the same stitches in the same order, and any differences in the swatch are due entirely to the yarn and its characteristics, which includes the needles that the manufacturer recommends and all of those things. So if you compare the size of a swatch like this, which is Malabrigo Chunky, versus this little swatch, which is Kelborn Woolen's Andorra, you can see that there's quite a difference in size, and that's just due to the grist of the yarn, the size of the yarn. So that's very helpful to people. Just it can be hard to imagine and to visualize the difference when you're looking at just single strands as to how the gauge is going to differ between 2 different yarns. So these are both from Kelborn Woolens. And if you look at a single strand of them, they maybe don't look too incredibly different, but knit up with the recommended needle size, they're quite different. So let's get granular. Let's take a look at the individual sections of the swatch and things that you might look out for, either if you're looking at swatches, if you happen to come into the shop, or look at swatches at other shops and they have similar characteristics, or if you work up one of these swatches yourself, some things you might want to see and evaluate in terms of how the yarn behaves. So the first section is ribbing. And we put ribbing at the bottom because that's generally where ribbing shows up on projects, at the bottom or the top, depending on how the object was knit. But sock cuffs, hat rims, sleeves, cuffs on sleeves, hems on sweaters. We value ribbing because of its ability to draw in. So one of the things to look for in the ribbing section is how much drawing in, which means how much pulling from side to side in towards the center does the ribbing do. And you can see in this Kelborn Woolen's Germantown selection, Germantown is a pretty iconically yarny yarn. It is 100% non-superwash wool. It is nice and plump and round, and it does all the things you expect wool to do. So the ribbing is very dimensional and it pulls in quite a bit. Whereas if we compare that to this swatch, which is GGH's Tivoli, you see the ribbing here exists. It is ribbing. It really doesn't pull in at all. Tivoli is a viscose cotton blend. The fibers have none of the grippiness of wool and none of the body. It's incredibly soft and incredibly drapey in a way that the Germantown is not, but it doesn't have the springiness, it doesn't have the draw in. So that is something to look for in the ribbing section, and one of the primary things to look for when you're knitting ribbing in a swatch. Does the ribbing behave in a way that you want it to if you're using the ribbing to create draw to keep, say, a sock up, or to pull in on the cuff of your sweater or something. Let's take a look at the next section. The next section is just a few rows of stockinette with a garter stitch border. And stockinette is your iconic knit fabric. Stockinette is what knitting looks like when people imagine. It's all those stacked up nice smooth little V's. Like the body of a traditional sweater is all stockinette. The outside of a sock is generally all stockinette outside of, you know, fancy patterns. So here's something that I like to look at in the stockinette section and encourage people to look at in the yarn, because this is a phenomenon that puzzles some people, or they can't really figure out where it's coming from or why. Both of these yarns, see, this is P. Merino, and this is still the Germantown. The V's of the knit stitches are pretty symmetrical. They line up and make nice, even, symmetrical V's. But occasionally you see other yarns that don't make nice, symmetrical little V's. And these are two swatches that we have that have that effect. If you look, there is the appearance of sort of vertical lines running up the stockinette fabric with little sort of slash mark shapes. It's more pronounced in the Gina. This is Gina. And this yarn is a cotton viscose blend as well. And the structure of these yarns, this one is a single, so a single ply yarn. This one is a cabled yarn, meaning there are smaller plied yarns that are then all plied together. And both of those yarn construction techniques are by nature a little bit unbalanced. They twist a little bit more in one direction than the other because of the way the energy is put into the plies of the yarn. And when you knit them up, it creates these off-balance little lines. And many knitters can drive themselves into fits trying to figure out why they're not getting nice symmetrical little V's and think that they've done something wrong. Think that they've somehow knit improperly, or they're holding their needles in a strange way, or they're putting too much twist into it on their own. It's a characteristic of the yarn. Whether the yarn is balanced or not plays a huge role in whether you're going to get this kind of surface texture or not. So it's helpful to know that it's something the yarn does, and it's a feature, not a bug. I think it's pretty attractive in many yarns. Some people can't stand it. Some people don't mind it at all. I think it's kind of cool when it happens. So it's one of those things in the fiber arts world that's going to be a matter of personal taste. The next section of the swatch is a seed stitch panel. And there are a few things we can tell in the seed stitch panel. And the most important things to look for, I think, in the seed stitch panel are stitch definition and what happens to the color of the yarn. The seed stitch section is very good for evaluating both of these. So what on earth is stitch definition? People talk about it a lot. It's a phrase that comes up. I use stitch definition to mean how well you can see the stitches of the yarn. If you've worked in a stitch pattern, like seed stitch, how well can you see the individual knits and purls? How much can you tell what the stitches are doing rather than what the yarn are doing? So if you look at this swatch, that is seed stitch. You are definitely looking at seed stitch here. And then if we choose another slightly fuzzier yarn, like this guy here, you can still see it's seed stitch, but maybe the knits and purls are a little more obscured than in the first swatch. Whereas if you look at this swatch right here, The seed stitch visually, from a distance, certainly, is going to be visually pretty much identical to the Stockinette swatch, because this is a nubby, thick and thin kind of yarn. It's got these little slubs in it, and what on earth? You might not want to spend a lot of time doing seed stitch in this yarn. Similarly, this is Shibui Vine, and it's hard to tell what's going on in most of the sections. So that's stitch definition, and something you can tell in the seed stitch section. When I talk about the seed stitch section being helpful for looking at color, when you look at the other sections of yarns, it's only a very narrow swatch. So for variegated yarns, for color changing yarns, for yarns with a lot of visual texture in them, you don't often get a good representative view of what it will look like on a whole project. But due to the structure of seed stitch, the knits and purls all stacked on one another and staggered in rows, the colors mix up a little bit and give you a slightly better view of how it might look visually in a whole project. So looking at the stripes in this swatch of Malabrigo Susurro in the Stockinette section, it's a much different quality in terms of the way they mix here in the seed stitch section. I think the seed stitch section looks a lot more impressive in terms of the way the colors mix, and give you an idea of how it might look to someone standing quite far away. Even if you were knitting something in Stockinette stitch, when you're looking at it up close, like I'm leaning in on this swatch, and you know, it looks like bigger chunks of blue and bigger chunks of gray. But if I pull away, the seed stitch is giving me a better idea. So we have this Gina swatch again, and even if the stitch definition isn't 100% great, I can tell that something's going on here, and I know it's seed stitch because I know the swatch, don't I? You can still see that the color transitions are doing interesting things in the seed stitch section. I think, and part of that, the nubbly texture plus the way it affects colors in variegated yarns are part of what makes seed stitch so attractive. In the next section, we have cables. And the cable section has some similar considerations to the seed stitch section. Does the stitch definition cause the cables to be visible? And then it has some similar concerns as the ribbing section. So if we look at this, you know, the cables are drawing in, they're very visible, they're big and chunky, just the way I like them. Whereas in this cotton and modal swatch, the cables are barely drawing in the fabric. The cables are visible, yes, but they lay very flat to the fabric, which could be desirable for a project you're working on, or it could defeat the entire purpose. And again, we look at a yarn like the quinoa here, and there are cables there, just like there's seed stitch here and there's ribbing here, but you might not know it if you didn't already know it. You can also look at the colorways or dye techniques to see if the cable is just going to disappear on you because of the color. This isn't a wildly variegated yarn. It's a long self-striping yarn, but you can see that even in this dark color with these little blips of the lighter green in the cable section, the cables aren't particularly visible. Even though they do have a lot of good texture, I can feel them. They draw the fabric in nicely. They're fairly plump in a single ply yarn, but they're just not so terribly visible at that section. The final section of the swatch is the lace section. And of course, all the things that we've talked about so far apply to lace. How is the stitch definition? How does the colorway affect whether or not you can see the individual stitches? But there's also the consideration of how open the eyelets of the lace are. Some yarns barely cling on strand to strand, so those eyelets really open up and give you big, beautiful open lace. In other yarns, either the balance of the plies or just the fluffiness, the fuzziness of the yarn could cause the eyelets to sort of squint shut and give you less open and impressive lace. And again, whether you like it big and flat and open, or if you want it to be a little bit sort of squishy, is a personal taste thing. But you do want to know before you go into a whole open work project what the yarn is going to do. So take a look at this. This is the that cabled cotton and viscose yarn I showed you before, and just like it makes slightly unbalanced, that texture of stockinette stitch, the lace winks shut on one side. You can see the eyelets over here are quite a bit smaller than the eyelets on the other side, and that is just the yarn doing its thing. And that is good to look for in these swatches. Whereas here, the yarn is more balanced. The stitches or the eyelets are more open, but maybe it's obscured by the color. Here, our Germantown again. Fairly good, open, even. This is a nice workhorse yarn that will do basically what you want it to under most situations. Whereas the Kelborn Scout here is the eyelets aren't quite so open, particularly looking at it from my vantage point like that. They're fuzzy and they close themselves up. But sometimes yarns that otherwise are impossible to see anything in are not so impossible to see lace in. So we've looked at this swatch of quinoa a few times, and the eyelets actually open up quite a bit, even though the cables disappear and the seed stitch disappears and the ribbing just lays there. The eyelets are really, really open. Similarly, this is Shibui Vine, which is a yarn with paper in. The stitch definition isn't exactly HD quality on this yarn, but the eyelets are super, super open. They still have the yarn's characteristic crinkliness and nubbliness, but the eyelets are definitely present. They're not getting lost in the structure of the yarn. They are very, very there, which is neat. So I hope this has given you a good understanding of what you can look for when you make a swatch like this. We're sharing the swatch pattern with you, so there's a link to that in the description. So if you have those skeins that you bought on a whim and you need to take for a spin before you decide what to do with them, give it a try. Try a little tiny sampler swatch like this and see what comes of it, because it's a fun way to get to know the qualities of a yarn that you're looking at without having to invest all of the time and energy into a complete project. So this has been the official episode 2 of Super Bulky. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.